First of all, let me say, I would not be here in front of you today. Absolutely, I would not be here without Jean-Paul Berthaud. He was not my professor, but in a strange way, he chose my dissertation topic for me. And when I came to do research on bayonets of the Republic, he made it possible for me to get the materials I needed in time to finish the book, to get a job. And I might have written the book, but I wouldn't have the job. And he was always so modest about his contribution. But I swear, I wouldn't be here without him, and he was a wonderful man. And I would only hope that I could do a little bit of the kind of thing he did for me, for other students of history. Now, my book is really a book on how to teach the history of terrorism. I am not trying to tell the government of the United States or France what to do. I would like to think that I might help them think about that in a different way. But here is my position. In other forms of warfare, it is the soldiers at the front, or those who are actually under the bombs, who are on the front line. But in this kind of war, all of you are on the front lines. All of my students are on the front lines. And the kinds of decisions that will be made will reflect our reactions to terrorism. So you have no alternative but to try to understand it. And I feel that I am not a soldier, but I am in this war by trying to teach people about terrorism. And in the process of teaching, I think we need to start with some generalizations that we can share, as long as we know that reality never matches your model. But models are helpful to get you in the right direction. So here you have my entire course on the history of terrorism on two sides of a piece of paper. It takes a lot longer than an hour to go through it all. But really, I tell my students, they get this the first day, and I said, if you understand everything on there, you've got the course. But it'll take you a semester. Okay. So you don't have to understand it all now. But there's a number of things in the paper that aren't here. For example, why I think that terrorism begins really, that revolutionary terrorism really doesn't begin until the 19th century. I also argue that simply using some modern military technology like symmetrical and asymmetrical war doesn't work well in terrorism. I think we need something with a bit more nuance. And we could talk about all of those things. I am most proud of this. That is the most original thing, okay? And again, there's more on that than we can deal with. But the notion of 4 basic patterns as the operations of terror and terrorism, I think is important. And the way that they will mix and they will come together in different combinations. They don't live in little boxes, but it's important to ask the questions of where are we in that? And what's confronting us now is this last one, evolution. And I believe that if we can talk about evolution, we can talk about devolution, about it going in the other direction. And I'm hoping that we can come up with a strategy which will allow that with ISIS. You will never eliminate all terrorists. You will never eliminate their causes, but you can move them down the scale of violence. Fundamental to my work on this is the notion that terrorism, most terrorism, not every little bit of it, most terrorism is a form of warfare. It is political violence for a purpose. Okay? And that is an idea that came to me not through studying terrorism, but through studying Mao Zedong and insurgency years ago and writing about Vietnam, which I've also written about. And he talked about warfare advancing in different forms. It isn't just if you're winning or you're losing, but you're changing the form of warfare. You are intentionally climbing a ladder. And I thought, why couldn't the first rung on that ladder be terrorism, not simply insurgency? So when we suffered the attacks of 9/11 in 2001, I thought my response would be to come up with a course on the history of terrorism. It took 2 years to develop it. I've taught it every year since. It has never been the same. When I begin a semester, I say, the syllabus, the list of our lectures, it will not survive. And it never has. And my heavens, it certainly hasn't survived this fall. So, I'm in the mood to learn from other people's questions, from other students' questions, because it helps me change and I hope improve the way I teach it to still other students. Okay, let's talk about terrorism as being historical. Okay? Almost every book you will read about the history of terrorism will tell you about the French Revolution for a while. That's good, but it's not revolutionary terrorism, even if it happened in a revolution. It was state terrorism. We got a vocabulary from it, but state terrorism is much older. My chapter on state terrorism in the book begins with the first Qin emperor in China, who did the unforgivable. He buried historians alive because they wouldn't burn their books. He literally did. He wanted to control the knowledge of the Chinese past, so he commanded that all but a few scholars destroy their scrolls and everything. And many didn't do it because they were, and 400 and some of them were buried alive. That's state terrorism. Worse than Robespierre, but it's state terrorism. Military terrorism, acts of terror, which go along with my 6 traits, but are done by armies, as old as history. As old as history. And as recent as yesterday. Acts of social terror are as old as history. Now, I'm American. Americans suffered from terrorism. But the greatest act of terror in the United States was not 9/11. It was the persecution, the repression of African Americans, of les Noirs, by white supremacists in the United States. And I devote an entire chapter to that because I need to tell my American students, you're guilty too. That you have a past of oppression and of terrorism. What is most important now is revolutionary terrorism. Now, You need not be somebody on the left to commit revolutionary terrorism. You can be, a Salafist. You can want to revive the old Islam. It's a question of change, and a change which will be brought by violent means. One thing that every major terrorist group that I have studied shares is the notion that the only way to bring change is through violence. The other methods aren't there. So it's all about violence. Okay. Now, I think that does not start until after the revolutions of 1848. Now, where did I'm going to give you a concept here. There's an American historian and sociologist of the French Revolution and other periods of French history named Charles Tilly. And he wrote a book, I don't know if it was ever translated into French, called The Contentious French. You people are always fighting among yourselves, okay? And he talked about repertoires of contention, and that these shift over time. Now, in my work on the culture of war in De la Guerre, or My Battle, Combat and Culture, have repeatedly come to the conclusion that people aren't very original. They tend to imitate. They do innovate at times, but most things are an imitation of other people. I also sometimes think that the best innovations that seem to come out of nowhere is when people misconceive what they're imitating and do something new instead. At any rate. So I wanted to look for the point at which terrorism becomes part of the repertoire of armed resistance. I'm borrowing that from Charles Tilly. By the way, Charles Tilly also was very good to me. At any rate. So I wanted to see when terrorism became one of those things that other people imitate, when it became a way you do things. So if you're going to look at books on the history of terrorism, they'll often start with the Sicarii. These were Jewish terrorists against the Romans back in the 1st century AD. They certainly acted like terrorists, okay? However, in their book on Jewish terrorism in Israel, and it's called Jewish Terrorism in Israel, Pedro Azur and his partner talk about them, and they say, and because of the terrible consequences, the diaspora that follows the Sicarii, it then becomes part of Jewish law. You can't engage in terrorism. That is not creating a repertoire. That's a dead end. Then people talk about the Hashashin. Okay, we get our word assassin from it. Okay, yeah. Except the Hashashin weren't a little terrorist group. They had cities that went from Syria, all the way to Iran. They had armies. They used a certain amount of terrorism, but it's much more a state activity than it is a terrorist group. And by the way, it didn't go anywhere. I mean, eventually, some of the Hashashin become paid assassins, like something out of James Bond, but it is not part of a repertoire. You don't get a continuous repertoire until 1848, and we're right where it became necessary. We are in Paris, because it's the failure of the barricades in 48 that moves us to a new repertoire. Now, there's a very good book on that. I'm forgetting the title right now, but it's on the barricades, and it's by a French historian. There is another book that you wouldn't know much about. It's by a man by the name of Jonathan House. And he studies how the Army deals with 1830 and 1848 as military campaigns. It's a very interesting book because he is a U.S. Army military historian. They both come to the conclusions that the barricades finally don't work. It's not just technology. It's also a resolve of the government to use more force to overcome the barricades. Part of the reason that the soldiers do not succeed in 1830, and you get the Trois Glorieuses, or in February of 1848, is because the government doesn't want to kill its own people. The king does not want to kill his subjects. That would be admitting they don't love him, okay? But Second Republic has no problem killing people. And you get the June days. And if you look at the Prussians example, you go from March to October, and there's a change. But the barricades allowed you to raise a flag and create an army of revolutionaries in a matter of hours. And the barricades, while they couldn't have worked in open field warfare, in the confines of a city, worked real well as long as there were certain limitations on how much the forces of order, the Royal Army or its militias, would do to repress. Now, in earlier forms of resistance, you had surprising similarity in weaponry, in numbers of troops, in capacity between rebels and the forces of order. Part of it is, we're good military historians, royal armies were often created by bringing the private armies of people who might be rebels the next day together so that you had similarity. Then, with the rise of the armies of Louis XIV and those transformations, which are organizational as well as tactical and technical, you reach a situation in which rebels could not match the Royal Army in the field, but rebels could in the confines of an urban resistance. So we don't have similarity anymore, we have parity. In those special circumstances, when all you need to do is know how to load and fire a flintlock and just stick up your head for a while and shoot, you're as good as the trained soldier because all you need to do is hold that barricade. What happens after 1848 is that's not possible either. It's not possible for lots of reasons, and the best argument, the best explanation is by Frederick Engels. Now, Engels wasn't the only one to see that. Karl Marx saw it.